Jeremy Bentham is one of those figures whose name can feel like a label. Utilitarian, reformer, the greatest happiness principle, until you pause and remember that a label is never the person. Bentham lived a whole life inside an age that was remaking itself with startling speed. He was born in London in 1748, in the long afterglow of the scientific revolution and right in the middle of the Enlightenment. He died in 1832. The same year, Britain passed the Reform Act that began, however imperfectly, to widen political representation. Between those dates, you can feel the world shifting beneath his feet. The growth of commerce and industry, the swelling of cities, the hardening of class lines, and the rise of modern state administration. Bentham is not a thinker who hovers above that transformation. He dives into it. He tries to grab the machinery of law and turn its gears toward human well-being. Bentham's biography matters because his philosophy is not the kind that grows best in solitude. He was not content to describe the world. He wanted to redesign it. As a child, he was unusually precocious, immersed in books and legal texts early, and he moved through elite education at Westminster School and then Oxford. He trained as a lawyer and was called to the bar, but he hated the experience. The law as practiced around him felt less like a rational system of public protection and more like an inherited tangle of tradition, privilege, and professional self-interest. He came to see the legal profession as a kind of priesthood guarding its mysteries, and that disgust becomes one of the fuel sources of his life's work. He wanted the law to be intelligible, measurable, accountable, and above all, justifiable in terms that made sense to ordinary human beings. To understand why Bentham matters, it helps to see what he was reacting against. In 18th century England, the legal system was a tangled growth of precedent, archaic language, and immense discretionary power. Criminal punishment could be severe, and the social order was defended with a confidence that often treated suffering as morally deserved. Public hangings, transportation, harsh prison conditions, debtors' prisons, rigid class barriers. These were not merely facts of life, but institutional choices, and Bentham's obsession is that a society should be able to explain its choices. If you inflict pain, you should be able to say why. If you create a rule, you should be able to say what it achieves. If your institutions grind human beings down, you should not hide behind the comfort of precedent. You should either justify what you are doing or change it. That question is the pulse of Bentham's thought. It is also why he can feel oddly modern. Many philosophers before him asked how to live well, how to cultivate virtue, how to obey divine command, how to align the soul with cosmic order. Bentham asks how to build a world that makes living well more possible for more people. He is not primarily a philosopher of private purity. He is a philosopher of public structure. He wants ethics to be useful in the literal sense, a tool for shaping laws, institutions, and everyday choices so that human misery is diminished and human flourishing becomes more likely. In Bentham's hands, moral philosophy is not a decorative conversation. It is a kind of engineering, and the raw material is human experience: pleasure, pain, fear, hope, security, humiliation, relief. Bentham's basic insight begins in a place so simple, we often miss its implications. Human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain. He opens an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, first published in 1789, with the claim that nature has placed us under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It sounds like rhetoric, but Bentham means it as a foundation. If pain and pleasure govern our actions, then any moral theory that ignores them is talking about a fantasy species, not human beings. Bentham is not saying that people are always selfish or that people never act from principle. He is saying that whatever our principles are, they matter to us because of how they shape our lives and the lives of others, because of the felt reality of suffering and the felt reality of satisfaction, security, joy, and peace. From there, Bentham proposes what becomes his signature, the principle of utility. An action is right, he argues, insofar as it tends to increase happiness and decrease suffering for those affected. An action is wrong insofar as it does the opposite. Morality, in this view, is not primarily about obedience to sacred rules or loyalty to inherited customs. It is about consequences. Bentham is a consequentialist, and he is unusually blunt about it. He does not ask whether an act fits a timeless command. He asks what it does to the balance of well-being over harm. At first, this seems humane and almost obvious. Who would deny that suffering is bad and happiness is good? But Bentham's move is more radical than it looks, because it shifts the center of moral authority. If consequences are what matter, then tradition is no longer automatically justified. A law does not become morally good simply because it is old. A punishment does not become morally acceptable simply because it is customary. A hierarchy does not become legitimate simply because it has existed for centuries. Bentham is essentially saying, stop using the past as a substitute for reasons. If a practice increases misery, then it is morally suspect, no matter how venerable it is. If a reform reduces misery, then it deserves serious consideration, even if it feels unfamiliar. He also refuses the moral romance of suffering. In older moral systems, suffering is sometimes treated as spiritually valuable, purification, discipline, proof of virtue. Bentham does not deny that people can find meaning in hardship, but he will not build an ethical system on the idea that pain has intrinsic worth. Pain is an evil. If we inflict it, we must have a reason that outweighs it. We must prefer the lesser evil to the greater. That is why Bentham becomes such a fierce critic of cruelty masquerading as justice. He is suspicious of punishments that exist mainly to satisfy outrage. He is suspicious of laws that exist mainly to enforce conformity. He is suspicious of moral rhetoric that praises pain without proving that the pain prevents a greater harm. Because Bentham wants ethics to be practical, he tries to give the principle of utility a method. This is where his famous philosophic calculus comes in. Bentham proposes that pleasures and pains can be evaluated by dimensions such as intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, fecundity, purity, and extent. In ordinary language, how strong is it? How long does it last? How likely is it? How soon will it occur? Does it lead to more of the same? Is it mixed with the opposite? And how many people does it reach? This can sound almost comically mechanistic, as if morality were a ledger. But the point is less that you can do perfect arithmetic, and more that you can discipline your moral imagination. Bentham wants you to stop thinking in slogans and start thinking in effects. The calculus is often mocked as naive, as if Bentham imagined we could carry a moral spreadsheet and compute our way to righteousness. But if you treat it less as a literal calculator and more as a discipline of attention, it becomes more persuasive. Bentham is saying, stop moralizing in the dark. Try to think clearly about what your choices actually do. When you declare something wrong because it disgusts you, ask whether it produces real harm or merely violates taste. When you defend a tradition because it feels natural, ask who pays the cost of that tradition. When you advocate a policy because it sounds tough or noble, ask what suffering it produces and what suffering it prevents. Bentham wants moral judgment to become accountable to reality. Bentham also identifies two rival moral principles that he believes confuse people: the principle of asceticism and the principle of sympathy and antipathy. The ascetic principle treats pleasure as suspicious and pain as virtuous, moral goodness as self-denial for its own sake. The sympathy and antipathy principle treats moral judgment as the expression of personal likes and dislikes. We call something wrong because we hate it, and we call something right because we approve of it. Bentham thinks both approaches are unreliable. The ascetic principle risks glorifying needless suffering. The sympathy and antipathy principle risks turning morality into a mask for prejudice. Against both, he offers the utilitarian test. What are the consequences in terms of happiness and suffering? That test does not solve every problem, but it forces moral claims to present a case. A beginner-friendly way to grasp Bentham is to imagine him standing beside a modern policy debate and refusing to be satisfied with slogans. Consider a city deciding whether to invest heavily in addiction treatment, housing, and mental health services, or to clean up the streets through aggressive policing alone. Bentham would insist on concrete questions. How many overdoses will be prevented? How many assaults will be reduced? How many families will stay intact? How many people will avoid jail trauma? What happens to children when a parent is repeatedly incarcerated? What happens to public trust when force becomes a first resort? Bentham is not sentimental here. He is demanding. He is saying that policy should be morally evaluated by its human effects, not by its symbolic posture. Bentham also applies this reasoning to personal ethics. If you are torn between honesty and kindness, between loyalty and fairness, between self-interest and generosity, Bentham does not hand you a sacred rule. He asks you to consider which course of action produces the better balance of well-being over harm, not only immediately, but over time. That time dimension matters. Bentham is not saying, choose what feels good right now. He knows that short-term pleasure can breed long-term pain, and that temporary discomfort can prevent lasting misery. In utilitarian terms, the moral question is not, does this hurt right now, but does this hurt in a way that prevents greater harm, or does it hurt pointlessly? Yet once you accept happiness as a yardstick, a new question appears: whose happiness counts? Bentham's answer is one of the most morally democratizing commitments in modern philosophy. Everybody's happiness counts, and it counts equally. The pleasure of the powerful is not morally heavier than the pleasure of the poor. The suffering of the invisible is not morally lighter than the suffering of the celebrated. Bentham's utilitarianism implies an ethical egalitarianism. If pain and pleasure are the currency of morality, then every person's pain and pleasure must be included in the moral accounting. This is not merely arithmetic. It is a refusal to treat certain lives as inherently more valuable because of birth, wealth, gender, or social status. This equal consideration does not automatically make Bentham a modern egalitarian in every political sense. He still thought in the language of his time and could miss forms of oppression that later thinkers would expose with sharper clarity. But the structure of his ethic contains a dangerous seed for entrenched hierarchies. If suffering is what matters, then the suffering of the marginalized matters as much as the suffering of the privileged. Once you accept that, many polite justifications for inequality begin to sound like excuses for protecting comfort at the expense of pain that society has decided not to see. Bentham's utilitarian logic drives him toward legal and political reform. He criticized the chaos and cruelty of criminal law, arguing that punishment is itself an evil, pain inflicted by society, and therefore must be justified by preventing a greater evil. Punishment, in Bentham's view, is only defensible if it reduces overall harm, usually through deterrence, incapacitation, or rehabilitation. If it does not reduce harm, then it is simply revenge dressed in legal clothing. And revenge, for Bentham, is morally suspect because it satisfies an emotion without necessarily preventing future suffering. If a punishment is harsher than necessary, then society is manufacturing misery and calling it justice. This concern with unnecessary suffering explains why Bentham is so focused on institutions. He is fascinated by the idea that systems can be designed to shape behavior. A well-designed institution, he believes, can reduce abuse, reduce corruption, and increase well-being. He also believes institutions should be transparent and accountable, because secrecy breeds cruelty and self-interest. In modern terms, Bentham is both an ethicist and a systems designer. He wants the structure to do some of the moral work by reducing temptation, clarifying rules, and aligning incentives with public good. This is where we meet the most famous and controversial symbol of his thought, the panopticon. Bentham proposed a prison design in which a central watchtower could observe all prisoners in surrounding cells. While the prisoners could not know when they were being watched, the power of the design is psychological. The possibility of observation encourages self-regulation. Bentham believed this could make prisons more orderly and perhaps even more humane because it would reduce the need for physical violence by replacing it with the quiet pressure of visibility. It is easy to see how a reformer could convince himself of the benefit. Fewer beatings, fewer riots, fewer abuses hidden in dark corners. To many modern ears, this sounds chilling, and that reaction matters. Bentham forces us to confront a moral ambiguity that never goes away. Systems designed to reduce suffering can also become tools of domination. Bentham saw surveillance as a path to order and reform. Later thinkers saw the panopticon as a metaphor for modern power, the internalization of control, the transformation of people into self-policed subjects, the creation of obedience not by chains, but by uncertainty. Even if Bentham's intent was to reduce misery, the mechanism he proposes, visibility as control, has a life beyond his intentions. That is why Bentham remains relevant in an age of cameras, data, and algorithms. Today we are surrounded by observation, phones that track location, platforms that record behavior, employers that monitor productivity, states that gather data in the name of security, retailers that profile consumers, insurers that model risk. Many of these systems are justified in utilitarian terms. They increase safety, increase efficiency, reduce fraud, prevent harm. Bentham gives us the language to evaluate such claims, but he also gives us the responsibility to do it honestly. If we accept the greater good as a justification for surveillance, we must ask what suffering is being created in exchange. Fear, chilling effects on speech, discrimination, abuse of power, the slow erosion of privacy that makes citizens less free. Bentham's framework is not an automatic endorsement of surveillance. It is a demand for full accounting of its human consequences. Bentham's thinking about rights shows another side of his radicalism. He famously attacked the idea of natural rights, mocking claims about inherent pre-political rights as nonsense upon stilts. The phrase is sharp, but the argument is serious. Bentham believed rights are not mystical entities floating above society. Rights are protections created and enforced by law. To say, "I have a right," is, for Bentham, to say there is a rule and a mechanism that protects me. And someone will pay a cost if they violate that protection. In this view, rights are not gifts from nature, they are achievements of institutions. This position can alarm modern listeners because many of us treat human rights as sacred. But Bentham is not necessarily saying rights are unimportant. He is saying that if you want rights to be real, you must build institutions that protect them. A right written in a declaration but not defended in courts, policing, and public norms is fragile. Bentham is trying to anchor rights in practical reality. Yet anchoring rights in law brings a danger. If law is the source of rights, then unjust law can erase rights. Bentham's critics worry that this makes rights too dependent on whoever controls the legal apparatus. Bentham would likely respond that the safeguard is political reform and public accountability, the same reforms he spent his life arguing for. But the tension remains, and it is a tension that still shapes modern debates about whether rights are moral truths or legal products. Bentham's consequentialist defense of liberty can be strong. He supported freedoms such as speech and religion, not because nature granted them, but because he believed they promoted progress and reduced suffering. Free expression allows errors to be exposed. It allows abuses of power to be challenged. It allows individuals to live with fewer forms of coercion and fear. Bentham's argument is empirical and political. Liberty is valuable because it tends to produce better lives, and because censorship tends to protect power at the expense of truth. His defense of liberty, then, is not a romantic hymn to autonomy. It is a pragmatic case that societies function better and more humanely when people can speak, think, and live without needless interference. One of the most compassionate turns in Bentham's thought appears when he considers animals. In a sentence that still echoes through modern debates, he argued that the relevant question is not whether animals can reason or speak, but whether they can suffer. The shift is astonishing for his era. It places moral significance not in intelligence or status, but in sentience. If suffering is morally important, then suffering wherever it occurs is morally important. Bentham's utilitarianism becomes here an early foundation for animal ethics, a way of breaking the human habit of treating other creatures as mere things, because the capacity to feel pain is a morally relevant fact. Bentham also held views on gender and sexuality that were, for his time, unusually reformist. He criticized legal structures that treated women as subordinate and supported changes in family law. He also argued against the criminalization of homosexual acts. These positions did not come from a romantic ideal of liberation. They came from the same utilitarian demand. If a law creates pain without compensating social benefit, it is a bad law. Bentham again and again tries to drag morality away from taboo and into the sunlight of consequences. If the only function of a prohibition is to enforce disgust, he wants it questioned. If the only result of a punishment is to multiply suffering, he wants it revised or abolished. His personal life shows a strange consistency with his public project. Bentham was an eccentric, and perhaps his most famous eccentricity is his auto-icon. After his death, his body was preserved and displayed, dressed in his clothes, at University College London. The story is bizarre enough to become a joke, but it also reveals Bentham's stubborn belief that everything, education, law, even death, could be turned towards human benefit. It is as if the reformer refused to let the world turn him into a mere memory. He wanted to be a continuing object lesson, an emblem of the idea that usefulness is not a dirty word. Bentham's influence is enormous. In law, he helped shape legal positivism, the view that law is a human creation rather than a reflection of divine order. In politics, he influenced reformers pushing for more rational legislation and broader participation. His followers and allies, sometimes called the philosophic radicals, helped carry utilitarian reasoning into debates about suffrage, administration, and legal reform. In public administration, his spirit shows up in the modern habit of evaluating policy through outcomes and evidence. Cost-benefit analysis is not identical to utilitarianism, but it descends from the same impulse, to justify public decisions by showing how they reduce harm and increase welfare. You can see Bentham's fingerprints in modern ethics as well. Medical triage often involves utilitarian reasoning, allocate scarce resources to maximize lives saved or life years preserved. Disaster response often involves utilitarian reasoning, prioritize interventions that prevent the greatest harm for the greatest number. Climate policy inevitably invites utilitarian thinking, because decisions made now shape the suffering and flourishing of millions, including future generations who cannot vote. Bentham's framework forces you to consider those silent stakeholders. If the moral point is to reduce suffering, then future suffering matters too. Bentham's utilitarianism can therefore expand moral concern beyond the immediate circle of the present. But Bentham's power is also what makes him vulnerable to criticism. One classic criticism is that utilitarianism flattens value. Are all pleasures commensurable? Can the joy of reading a poem be weighed on the same scale as the pleasure of a sugary drink? Bentham's early formulations can sound as if the answer is yes. Pleasure is pleasure, and the difference is quantity and circumstance. Critics worry that this reduces the richness of human life to a single dimension, as if the soul were a thermometer. They suspect that something is missing: dignity, depth, the difference between a life that is merely comfortable and a life that is meaningfully lived. This is where John Stuart Mill becomes the most famous heir and critic within the family. Mill accepts Bentham's foundation: happiness matters, consequences matter, but argues that pleasures differ in quality as well as quantity. Some pleasures engage the higher faculties, reason, imagination, moral feeling, and are in a sense worth more than purely bodily pleasures. Mill's move is often read as an attempt to rescue utilitarianism from the charge that it is fit for pigs. Whether Mill succeeds is still debated, but the fact that he felt the need to revise Bentham tells you something. Bentham's clarity can be too thin unless it is deepened by a richer account of what happiness actually involves. Another criticism is the justice problem. Imagine a scenario where punishing an innocent person would calm a violent crowd and prevent widespread suffering. A crude utilitarian calculation might suggest sacrificing one innocent life to save many. Most people feel, instantly, that this is unjust. Bentham would likely reply that such an act would destroy trust in the legal system and therefore create long-term insecurity that produces greater suffering. In other words, he would try to show that justice is usually aligned with utility, because reliable rules protect everyone's security and therefore increase welfare in the long run. But notice what is happening. Bentham is trying to derive justice from consequences. Critics argue that justice is not merely a tool, it is a moral constraint. They fear utilitarianism can justify horrors if the arithmetic seems favorable. Even if Bentham can often argue that horrors backfire, the anxiety remains. What if the long run does not correct the calculus quickly enough for the person sacrificed in the present? What if the powerful control the calculation? What if the greatest good becomes a mask for domination? This is why utilitarianism sometimes feels like the moral language of bureaucracy. Modern societies often speak about acceptable losses, trade-offs, and collateral damage. Bentham did not invent that coldness. but his method can be used to rationalize it. The moral task, then, is not merely to accept or reject Bentham, but to ask how utilitarian reasoning can be disciplined so it does not become an excuse for cruelty. The discipline begins with honesty about uncertainty, humility about measurement, and a relentless attention to who bears the burdens. One discipline is humility about measurement. Bentham's calculus can tempt us to believe we know more than we do. We often cannot measure suffering accurately, especially across social divides. We underestimate harms that are invisible to us: humiliation, chronic fear, long-term trauma, the slow corrosion of trust. We overestimate benefits that make the powerful feel safer. Bentham's method, therefore, demands something many decision-makers resist: attention to those who bear the costs, and a willingness to revise policy when evidence shows that the costs are heavier than the defenders admitted. Another discipline is attention to distribution, not just totals. A policy can raise total welfare while intensifying misery for a minority. Bentham pushes us to count everyone, but counting is not the same as protecting. This is where later political philosophy, influenced partly by and partly against utilitarianism, tries to build stronger safeguards, constitutional limits, due process, equal protection, and a language of rights that does not collapse entirely into aggregate welfare. In a sense, modern liberal democracies attempt a synthesis. Pursue welfare, but restrain the pursuit with safeguards that protect individuals from being sacrificed to the crowd. Now bring Bentham into the most contemporary arena: algorithmic decision-making. We live in a world increasingly governed by optimization. Platforms optimize engagement, companies optimize profit, governments optimize risk. Engineers build systems with objective functions that translate messy human goals, like safety, fairness, or public benefit, into measurable proxies. This is Bentham's world in a new costume. Utilitarian thinking fits naturally with optimization because both speak the language of outcomes. But this alignment is precisely what makes Bentham both a guide and a warning. He is a guide because he forces us to ask what a system is optimizing for and who pays the pain. If a platform optimizes engagement by feeding outrage, Bentham would ask whether the pleasure of stimulation outweighs the pain of polarization, anxiety, and misinformation. If an automated system optimizes efficiency in hiring, Bentham would ask whether it quietly amplifies discrimination, creating long-term social harm that dwarfs the short-term convenience. If a health system optimizes cost containment, Bentham would ask whether it does so by quietly rationing care away from those who already suffer most. In each case, Bentham insists that the moral truth is not in the slogan, but in the lived consequences. He is a warning because utilitarian rhetoric can become the perfect justification for control. "We did it for the greater good" is one of the most seductive sentences in political life. Bentham gives that sentence structure and credibility. The antidote is not abandoning concern for the greater good, but demanding transparency. Show the evidence, show the trade-offs, and show how the burdens are distributed. If the greater good always requires the same people to suffer, then it is not the greater good. It is the management of pain to protect privilege. Bentham also invites beginners to see moral philosophy as something you can argue with rather than merely admire. Many ethical systems ask you to accept a worldview. Bentham asks you to test a claim. If someone says a law is necessary, you can ask what suffering it prevents and at what cost. If someone says an act is immoral, you can ask what harm it produces and what happiness it destroys. Bentham's ethic is argumentative, public, and practical. It treats moral talk as accountable to reality. At the same time, Bentham leaves a question that refuses to go away. Can the good be reduced to happiness? People seek not only pleasure, but meaning, identity, love, loyalty, honor, and sometimes sacrifice. Some of those pursuits involve pain willingly endured for a purpose. Bentham would respond that meaning and love are themselves deep sources of happiness, and that suffering is only justified when it leads to greater well-being. But the tension remains because human beings sometimes choose misery over comfort for reasons that do not translate neatly into a calculus. The utilitarian must either expand the notion of happiness to include the fulfillment of deep projects and values, or admit that something important is being left out. That tension can be productive rather than fatal. It forces you to ask what you mean by happiness. If happiness is mere sensation, Bentham will feel thin. If happiness includes security, freedom, trust, dignity, and the ability to pursue meaningful projects, Bentham becomes deeper and more plausible. The utilitarian question then becomes not how do we maximize shallow pleasure, but how do we build a world where human beings can live less afraid and more fulfilled? In that expanded sense, Bentham's insistence on counting pain and pleasure becomes an insistence on counting the real conditions of a humane life. As we end this deep dive, it is worth returning to the emotional tone of Bentham's project. For all his talk of calculus and utility, he is animated by moral impatience with cruelty. He cannot stand the way societies justify suffering with tradition. He cannot stand the way institutions become self-protecting machines that forget the human beings inside them. Bentham's most basic demand is almost childlike in its clarity. If you are going to hurt people, you must have a reason. And if your reason is simply habit, disgust, or vengeance, then it is not good enough. So Bentham leaves us with a habit of mind. When you encounter a rule, ask what it is for. When you encounter a punishment, ask what harm it prevents. When you encounter a taboo, ask whether it protects anyone or merely polices conformity. When you encounter a new technology sold as progress, ask who gains and who loses. When you hear the phrase, the greater good, ask whether the good is truly greater for everyone or merely greater for those who already hold power. And when you make choices in your own life, ask not only what will satisfy you in the moment, but what will reduce harm and increase the possibility of flourishing for the people whose lives touch yours. Bentham is not the last word on morality, and he would not want to be. He would want to be a lever, something you can use to move a stuck world. In that sense, his philosophy is not a monument, but a toolkit, and perhaps the most honest way to honor him is to keep doing what he did. Interrogate the systems around you. Refuse to sanctify suffering, and insist that ethics is not a decoration for the mind, but a discipline for making life more humane.